Trek leads the federally funded University Transportation Center, NITSE, the National Institute for Transportation Communities. It's one of 7 nationally funded centers across the US, and our research focuses on improving mobility for people and goods to build strong communities. Our webinars are based on original research conducted by faculty, researchers, and students, such as the presenters you'll be hearing from today. And we are looking to get research results into the hands of practitioners, academics, and other stakeholders like yourselves. Our speakers today are Ivis Garcia Zambrana, Alan DeLaTorre, and Jaeyoung Kim. Dr. Alan DeLaTorre is a research associate at Portland State University's Institute on Aging, where he coordinates PSU's Senior Adult Learning Center and Age-Friendly Portland and Multnomah County Initiative. Dr. Ivis Garcia Zambrana is an assistant professor in the City and Metropolitan Planning at CMP. She works in close collaboration with university neighborhood partners, and she's also affiliated with the Metropolitan Research Center. Jaeyoung Kim is a doctoral student at the Department of City and Metropolitan Planning at the University of Utah, and she holds a Bachelor of Architecture from Hanyang University in Seoul, Korea, and a Master of City Planning from the University of California in Berkeley. Before diving into the webinar, I'd like to let you know about a few more of our upcoming online events. This Friday, you can watch it online. Gabe Graff of PBOT and Kelly Bitteridge of TriMet will be speaking at our Friday seminar on how to identify, design, and build capital and operational treatments to help buses move more quickly and reliably through Portland's congested central city. And our next NITSE webinar will be October 8th, where Dr. Crispin Sayre and Nathan McNeil of Portland State University will present on contextual guidance at intersections for protected bike lanes. We also have our annual TCS event coming up September 19th and 20th. Registration is open. It connects national mobility-focused research, primarily from NITSE, to local practice and policy through breakout panels, like Pecha Kucha, posters, and a keynote. You can register at tcs2019.sketch.com. Before I hand it over to the presenters, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the webinar. They will present for about 40 minutes, and during this time you can submit questions which will be answered at the end of the webinar. We will be recording today's webinar and make it available on our website. You will also receive the video recording and presentation slides in an email following the webinar in the next day or two. If you track professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit, and you will get more information how to get that credit in your post-webinar email. During the presentation, you are welcome to submit questions using the questions pane on your control panel. I will be keeping track of questions, and presenters will respond to them at the end of the webinar. If we run out of time, we will send out written responses for any questions left unanswered. And with that, I will hand it over to the research team. Just one moment.
Well, thanks, Kate, for such a kind introduction. I know you're like changing slides, but today we will explore older adults' notions of aging in place.
Take it away.
Oh, thanks, Kate. So today we will explore older adults' notions of aging in place, which we define as just having older adults to give them the opportunity to continue to occupy familiar surroundings and to live in their own homes and communities. So the next slide. So most people want to age in place. So this is some of the research has shown. So 88% of older adults want to stay in their own homes, but also they want to stay in their own communities. However, the ability for older adults to stay or live, particularly in their homes, it really depends on their built environment. So if you can click the next slide. I'm going to go through these slides pretty quickly, actually. So we are like an interdisciplinary research, so between architects and also planners. So we were looking at definitions of mobility. Mostly when we think about planners, they define mobility thinking about the neighborhood and beyond. But when architects like look at mobility, they're looking at home and at buildings. So if we can go to the next one. I think that for planners and also for architects, where they might have intersect is in the idea of universal design. And this concept actually comes from architecture from Mays in 1998. So here we can see in this picture how you might have like curb ramps that are like kind of similar when we think about homes to wedge ramps. Next slide. And we have like handrails, and in public spaces we have like incorporated this idea of like having handrails where people can hold on to, as well as having like low rise steps in public spaces as well. But many of these ideas again are for the home and also public spaces and outside of the home. Next slide. Here we wanted to also define mobility from a public health perspective, and I think that for in public health is like much broader than in architecture and planning. So it looks at the relative ease and freedom of movement in all of its forms, but it also thinks about people meeting their basic needs, like getting goods, going to places, receiving services, and very importantly, interacting with people in their community, family and friends, and generally having like a high quality of life. Next slide. So this is like our research design. We conducted a survey and semi-structured interviews with like 50 low-income older adults in Portland and also in Salt Lake County. And so we chose people that were part of programs. So one of them is in Utah is Assess, and in Portland Unlimited Choices. So these are organizations that provide home modifications for older adults. So what we're looking at here is people who have their own self-determination of saying, I need to have like accessibility modifications in my home, and see how people were impacted by that. The idea of also choosing like older adults is like because often they are also more vulnerable to be leaving their homes because of the increasing rents or taxes, potential displacement, and so on. So next slide. And these are just different parts of the research, and later on, like Yayon and Alan will be talking about the findings. But something that we did, it was ask older adults to draw a boundary map of their neighborhood, and they define neighborhood in any way that they wanted. So it could be like social constructions or family and friends where it could be around transportation lines that they use. It could be about the past. So a lot of people talk about when they were younger, they used to go to these places that are attached to, and so on. Next slide. We had like a interview, and these were the aspects of the interview: the life before and after the home modifications, and how satisfied they were, if they were going to make any changes, what they will be, and this including the home, but also like outside of the home. We asked about like in a typical day, week, and month, where what will they go, and what are the things that they will do. And what were some of the barriers that they encountered getting around. We asked a lot of questions actually about public transportation, and also we asked them to define aging in place. And here in the picture, there's Jordan Pieper. He's like an undergrad student that actually ended up writing an article about this. Next slide. So we had like a survey, and we had our own questions. asking about social demographics or modifications, aging in place, mobility. But we also use like 3 validated instruments. So these are things that other researchers have used. I will go through them in the next slides. So the first one was the neighborhood environment workability scale, or NEWS for shorts, that Salins developed. And these are the types of questions that are asked. For example, how common are detached single-family residents in your immediate neighborhood? And I wanted to point out to these like different tools in case people want to actually like go and look them up. Next one. So this one is the Lawton instrumental activities of daily living scale. So this one actually looks at the level of independence that someone has. So it looks at things as like are people able to prepare their own food? Are they able to manage their finances, shopping, and so on? Next slide. This one perhaps is like the most important for us, thinking about the movement from home to outside of the house, people moving, going to the porch, walking the dog, even the yard, the neighborhood, the town, and like how people move to these spaces. So the life space mobility looks at that, but it also looks at the frequency of movement. And the degree of independence. If people use a cane, if people go with like someone that is assisting them, a walker, a wheelchair, and so on. Next slide. And for this tool, the life space assessment, because it was the most important for us, we made some modifications to try to incorporate more mobility from a planning perspective. So we will ask people about where they will go, like how often did they get there, and again, if they use any personal equipment. So the next slide. These are just like a summary of all the tools that we use, and these tools actually are in the report. You can find the surveys there, and you can find all the results for this. And so the next, John is going to present to us the findings, but we will divide them into the quantitative findings and the qualitative findings, and John will do the quantitative findings. So next slide.
Thank you, Ivis. I will keep presenting our quantitative findings. While we conducted the study in the 2 regions, Portland and Salt Lake County, the demographic and built environmental characteristic of participants between the 2 regions were comparable but somewhat different. So here, participants in Salt Lake County were comparably older than those in Portland and dominantly white. However, there were more Hispanic population in Salt Lake County as well. So if we consider non-Hispanic white, those are similar in both regions. And participants in Portland had high portion of educational attainment levels beyond high school, but less homeowners than Salt Lake County. Next, please. According to IADL and LSA score, older adults who participated in Portland were slightly more independent in daily lives, and they were more mobile than those in Salt Lake County, but not much. There were more participants in Salt Lake County using some kinds of assistive devices, and about half of them used a cane or walker. Next, please. And while 88% of participants in Salt Lake County lived in single-family housing, there was only 56% in Portland, and 36% of them lived in mobile home. And the neighborhood of participants in Portland had a higher walk score, and they had higher perceived residential density. But for other news scores were similar in both regions. Next, please. Home and neighborhood satisfaction were higher among Portland respondents. And in terms of aging in place, Most participants responded that they strongly want to age in place, while those in Portland showed a stronger desire than those in Salt Lake County. They want to age in place even if seriously ill. Next, please. As all participants received some kinds of home modifications, we asked whether they improved their lives in different aspects. The majority of participants answered that their mobility got improved, and it includes both at-home mobility and outside home mobility. And some said they improved connections to family and friends and overall social engagement as well. For example, they could go out more easily with some handrails or ramps to the outside for those activities. And one old lady said that home modifications actually helped her elderly friends to visit her home as well. So it's not only about them to going out, and also invite elderly friends to their house as well. Next, please. We also asked them about their modes of travel. The participants in Salt Lake County relied heavily on the automobile, whether they drive by themselves or a friend or family member gives them a ride to get to some places. On the other hand, the participants in Portland actively used public transportation. So among different modes of public transit, in Portland, light rail was mostly used. Oh no, in Salt Lake County, light rail was mostly used, and bus and light rail were both preferred in Portland. And also paratransit was preferable in Portland than Salt Lake County, and that kind of showing that older adults in Portland had more independence, while people in Salt Lake County were more dependent on their family and friends for give them a ride. Overall, so we had, overall older adults in Portland used mixed modes of travel, which might address some more accessibility issues in Salt Lake County. Next, please. So as I said before, Portland had more transit users. So 52% were transit users in Portland and 28% were transit users in Salt Lake County among our sample. Their IADL score and LSA score were higher in transit users than non-transit users, which is saying that older adults' independence of daily activities and mobilities are positively related to their use of transit. And additionally, transit users showed more satisfaction about their neighborhood as well. Next. For the question asking, what would make you ride public transportation more often? The ease of getting on and off were selected as a major concern. And those in Portland also want to go more places with transit. And there were also various issues such as safety, access, service price, and quality. Those kinds of things were addressed here. Next. For the perceived environmental barriers to getting around in their neighborhood, overall trend between the two regions were similar, but those in Portland showed higher interest in this topic. They counted absence of sidewalks and sitting or resting places, high traffic speed, and climate or weather as significant barrier for them. And since there were more walkers in Portland than Salt Lake County, the answers were more detailed and practically varied in Portland. Next. We also asked the question on what the participants like most about their neighborhood. It is notable that transient users were mostly satisfied with their choice of shopping and entertainment options and their connections to family and friends. And compared to that, the answer from non-transient users were more concentrated on their closeness to grocery stores. But this can be interpreted as they are not well addressed to other amenities except the necessities like grocery stores. And in Portland, public transportation was highly counted as their neighborhood satisfaction as well. Next. So as Ivis presented before, we also conducted some mapping exercise with a neighborhood boundary. The first noticeable finding was that there were two main types of neighborhood boundaries. One is circular around one's home, and the other is strip bounded. Next. And while the participants in Salt Lake County perceived their neighborhood scale larger than those in Portland, the perceived neighborhoods with the strip bounded types tend to be larger than those with circular types. And we found the same trend in both regions. Next, please. And also, transient users tend to perceive their neighborhood scale smaller than non-transient users, so who could be more car-oriented. Overall, considering our small sample size in this study, further research would be needed to better understand neighborhood perception among older adults. And from now on, Ellen will talk more about the concept of neighborhood through the qualitative findings.
All right. Thanks, Jae-young and Ivis and Kate as well. I think one of the strengths to this study was the fact that we had the qualitative data that helped in elucidating and learning more about the neighborhoods, understanding mobility and life space mobility aging in place. And so I'm going to dive in a little bit more to some of the qualitative responses, talk a little bit more as well about things like functional limitation, mobility aging in place, and then finish with some recommendations for future research and for practitioners. So the first piece is really interesting. I think that this highlights some of the important aspects of neighborhood that are not always physically defined. So the respondent, a Portland woman, said, "My neighbor is like a son to me. If he's going to the store, he gives me a shout and says, 'I'm going to Safeway, anything I could pick up for you?' He keeps me in the loop." I think that there are a number of things to unpack here. The physical proximity of this person to her neighbor was quite important, to know that they could kind of shout at each other to ask that question, to know that she had social supports. In addition to that, to understand that the destination of the grocery store was accessed by a car, even though it was not her car. And that came up a number of times in our research, is that we found that either formal or informal caregivers were providing people rides, and that was helping to define their neighborhood in certain ways, whether they saw it as their neighborhood or a kind of catchment area that included some services as well. So I'll keep going to the next slide to chat a little bit more about defining neighborhoods. So we actually had a lot of variation in our responses, and understanding neighborhood and defining neighborhood ended up being more complicated than we thought going into this project. So some of the factors that really mattered in defining neighborhoods included the location that people were living, as well as the presence of services and amenities. As we talked earlier, that presence of social connection was really important, and respondents' limited mobility. So if they had issues with respect to needing to use a walker, cane, or wheelchair, most of them ended up with a smaller catchment area. Although I do want to note that there was one gentleman in particular who was non-audible, as in he didn't speak over his entire life. And when I had interviewed him, realized that he was probably the most mobile person in the entire group that I interviewed. The main reason being that he was being taken out by his formal caregiver to connect socially in the community, but his recreational activity was essentially to be out of the house and to move around on transit, The bus riders knew him, the train riders knew, or drivers knew him as well. Moving on to the second bullet point, one of the real interesting aspects that we noticed in our looking at the qualitative and quantitative data is that medical and health services were not frequently detailed as kind of defining one's neighborhood. And I think that this ended up being more prevalent in Portland. I think Salt Lake County residents had noticed healthcare as something that's a more important amenity, as Jia-Young had noted earlier. But one of the things that's important to note is that healthcare facilities are not always located in one's neighborhood. So even if you have a hospital in your neighborhood or a healthcare facility, it doesn't mean that that's where you have insurance to go. So often these people would need to travel further for those medical appointments than they would for, say, a grocery destination or, you know, going to the local post office, etc. And then automobile use tended to expand the neighborhood catchment area. And I think people had that freedom to go along streets and to not need to worry about the fixed route services quite as much. So those folks who either had a car or were using cars of their caregivers, formal or informal, had a different neighborhood catchment kind of area. So next slide, please. A couple of important things to note about interviewee functional ability, and Ivis and Jia-Young had both talked about the IADL, or Instrumental Activities of Daily Living instrument that we use to collect data. But some additional aspects of functional ability came in, which would be known as activities of daily living. So those are things like eating, bathing, and toileting. So I think it's just important to note that all of these things were discussed, even though that Lawton et al. Instrument only really captured IADLs, or instrumental activities of daily living, things like cleaning and finances. But the top barriers to functional ability were stairs, stairs within the home and stairs outside of one's home. And I don't think that this is a big surprise or kind of groundbreaking finding, but what we found is that stairs were really interesting because they actually cut people off from aspects of their home. It cut them off from going out and engaging in social activities or having people come to their home for socialization. And also it created some barriers for accessing some services. So even though these stairs were specifically located in or on the house, that they had impacts beyond into one's kind of meso or neighborhood environment, and even the macro environment that would kind of bring people, whether they're friends or relatives or caregivers, in from a different place. Those stairs mattered a lot. Yeah, and the last point is that there was reliance on formal and informal caregiving that was noted in the sample in both Salt Lake County and Portland. All right, I'm gonna move on to the next slide. We really wanted to understand the concept of aging in place, and we asked folks to talk about it. The vast majority of people could articulate what aging in place meant, and that matched very similarly to what we saw in the literature. There were some people who did not understand the concept or hadn't heard of it or did not attempt to define it, but by and large, most people kind of understood it. This respondent in particular notes that, I think, to me, it means being able to not only live in my home and feel safe, say taking a shower or something like that, but also to be able to go to the grocery. Someone can come get me and take me somewhere. So I think that this is important because aging in place has two important components. The first being aging in one's home, the other being aging in one's community. And I think that this is a distinction in the gerontological community that's very clear. We talk about aging in place often as needing to match both that aging in one's home and aging in one's community to really be effective. And this quote really articulates that there's both that, you know, what's happening if you're using your shower in your bathroom, but also if you need to go to an amenity or service, and then who is it that might be able to connect you with that if you can't do it yourself. Next slide, please. Some common aging in place features, including attachment to home and place. So people were very fond of their communities and wanted to age in their home and community. Accessible home and community. So, you know, if you had sidewalks and curb cuts, if you had a lack of stairs, if you had well-kept kind of streets in general, that those were all aspects of or common features of aging in place. A familiar and desirable neighborhood. So folks who'd been in place for a while really felt like that was a good thing for them. And then access to services, as we've discussed a couple times. Established social connections were critically important to a lot of the respondents and really contributed to their desire to age in place. We did have a couple of respondents who talked about some negative social interactions, some pressures that they had with their families or neighbors that actually maybe pushed them to think about relocating, although those people were aging in place, even though they talked about some of the displeasures they had with their neighborhoods and neighbors, that they continued to age in that community. Several barriers to aging in place included mobility-related barriers, aspects of stairs, presence of stairs, no sidewalks, and poorly maintained infrastructure, cost and or frequency of transit. So we found even people who found discounted rates found it to be a little bit more expensive than they'd like, especially if they were living and dealing with housing affordability issues, which was also a major barrier to aging in place. And then this fear of crime and safety had people worried a little bit about how they might age in their home and age in their place over time. Next, oh, and just to note, the picture here is a grab bar that was put at the top of a staircase. This was a hazard essentially for the person who was going down. Didn't feel like that first step was a very good step. There was a little bit of a low rail on the other side, on the right side of the image. And so that extra grab bar helped them in navigating the beginning of the stairs and getting in a more safe way down that set of stairs. Next slide, please. So with respect to mobility at home and that concept of life space mobility, and here you can see that life space level 0 is the bedroom, life space 1 is the home, with that life space 2 being outside the home. And these two quotes are going to connect these two. But the first respondent said, when we bought this house, I thought it was wonderful to have those stairs. I used them for exercise. I'd go up and down and up and down and up and down, and now it's an effort. It really is hard. I am not going to say that architects in general think that stairs are good things, but I've had too many conversations with designers and architects who said, oh, stairs are good, even for older people, because it keeps them active. And I think that the most important thing to relay here is they're good for keeping people active until they're not, and it becomes a barrier for people in getting in and around their home. So there's some challenges, and I would challenge the assumption that stairs are good for older people in general. Moving on to the next quote, which is really moving to this mobility outside the home. If we could click to the next slide. The respondent talked about or said, I always just come in the back door because I had a railing there. You know, that gave me support. So it's nice to have it in front. It's nice to have it for other people if they wish to come visit me, because I had a lot of elderly friends that need it also. And I think that this is one of the things we saw several times emerge in this research, and was really, I think, important in our findings, is to understand that the physical accessibility of one's home really connected them with people. And some might have heard this quote that social isolation is now being compared to smoking about 15 cigarettes per day. This is becoming a public health crisis. In places like the UK, they've even created a loneliness SAR to try and solve some of these issues with respect to social isolation and lack of social connection. And so small modifications like this can really open up opportunities for older adults, people with disabilities, to connect socially with members of their community. Next slide, please. With respect to life space mobility, I think it was, in general, it was compromised by individuals' functional ability. Did they have a disability or difficulty getting in and around their home and neighborhood? Interestingly enough, there were varying degrees of success from the modifications. So not all of those who received modifications felt that they changed and improved their lives and happiness kind of in their homes and communities. There were some folks who still needed caregiving or still had some safety concerns and or fall risks even after a grab bar or staircase was added. In-home mobility was affected by those modifications such as ramps, stairs, and grab bars. And over time, home environments can become more limited to a resident, especially as mobility impairments emerge and increased supports are needed. And I think the most important thing to kind of note here is that this is in line with gerontological theory and literature to say that behavior, individuals' behavior is a function of both the person and their changing needs and the environment, and what might be changing kind of forms of environment. So home modifications can change an individual's ability to behave or interact in that environment. And the quote here that's on the right-hand side is that person said, "I had really gotten to a point where taking a shower I dreaded." And this idea that something as basic as keeping your hygiene up can be compromised without having something as simple as a grab bar to get in there. And there was one respondent I remember when I was interviewing that she would wait for her kind of caregiver, an informal family caregiver, to come over to take a shower. And that was only about twice a week, because that's basically when she felt safe enough to take a shower. Next slide, please. So getting to the last couple of slides here, some of the outside the home mobility was increased both by those ramps and grab bars and social supports, as we've talked about, but mobility aids, so if they used a walker, wheelchair, cane, and other transportation options, anything from the presence of a fixed route line to the use of paratransit to using somebody's car or driving themselves. With respect to barriers to outside mobility, inaccessible infrastructure was one of the top ones. The availability and proximity to services and amenities, changing transportation needs that resulted from safety concerns, the cost of transit. We were surprised to find that several people commented on the cost of transit, even at the discounted rate, and that there was difficulty in accessing some fixed route stops, especially when those were close to home. And I recall that there were some folks who just never learned how to ride a bus or had that comfort of riding a bus. And so even when that stop was located literally within 0.1 miles of their home, they still weren't using that. So next slide. With respect to services and amenities, this was really a key component to understanding life space mobility. Mobility was purpose-driven, so groceries or social connections were really a reason for getting out of the home. And mobility was best understood when considering a respondent's desired destination and how easy or difficult it was to reach that destination. Everything from leaving their home and their yard to accessing local transit or their vehicle of driving to a place. A respondent said, "I go to a grocery at least 3 times or more a week. I have to carry everything, getting off and on buses. I can only carry enough groceries for a couple of days." And this was a change. So effectively, she needed to begin using or visiting the store several times a week rather than just once or even twice as she was using transportation to get those, public transit to get those groceries. Next slide. Although equity was not a primary focus of this research, there were several equity-based issues that emerged and actually really lend themselves to future research. Affordable housing options were needed everywhere, and I cannot underscore the importance of affordable and accessible houses for aging in place and even life space mobility. Low-income neighborhoods tended to have lower quality infrastructure and lower levels of security, as well as inadequate transportation or services such as supermarkets, clinics, etc. I know here in Portland, as the further you get from the city center and inner ring suburbs, the less frequent transit is. So people still live out there, but they don't have the same access. And then some older adults really perceive equity as a personal access issue. So did they have or did not have access to things like transit services and infrastructure? And when they didn't, that was an inherent equity issue. Finally, concerns related to aging in place and mobility emerged from one LGBTQ respondent who talked about both some hateful things he had heard in walking and discomfort that he felt in living in a community when he was open, which changed the patterns he had for outside the home mobility. He kind of tended to walk outside of the mobile home rather than inside the mobile home because he didn't have that same sense of safety in this community that he lived in. So the woman at the bottom articulated this idea of pressure to sell her house. She said, every day someone calls me trying to buy this house. Where would I go? If I didn't live here, I have no idea. I'd probably go out of state. I can't see myself moving anywhere else. She was feeling pressure to sell her home. She had frequently received this kind of information, but she was worried that the lack of those social connections and the lack of familiarity would change her ability to age in place over time. So we could advance to the next slide. I think these are the last 2 slides here. Recommendations for future research include kind of the integration of these validated research instruments and semi-structured interviews that allowed us to dig a little deeper and get some qualitative responses, especially when thinking about life space mobility with older adults and people with disabilities. And future research is needed on that last point to expand the use of an equity lens and look further into understanding how neighborhoods and environments affect social connectivity. And then a number of, to the next slide, I've got a number of recommendations for home modifications and practitioners. I think the first is that very clearly home modifications such as ramps and grab bars clearly support aging in place. That programs are effective, Assist Inc. and Unlimited Choices were very effective, but knowledge of the program was limited and more outreach was needed. Modifications can improve accessibility and positively impact social connections. Current modification or comfort modifications, things like home temperature and leaky roofs, can also contribute to aging in place. So we found that some of the agency modifications that were happening were not listed on the kind of accessibility list, but something like home temperature, insulation was able to advance certain aspects of modification or aging in place. And then the final piece is that we need more proactive funding of modification programs and the advancing of knowledge of these programs, which all can advance a community's age friendliness. I think it's critically important to know that the Americans with Disabilities Act doesn't cover residential homes. You have to have 5 or more units essentially for that to kick in. So what we're talking about with homes and mobile homes in general is that accessibility is not required when they're being built, and a lot of folks are having problems with the inaccessibility of their environment as they exist now. The final slide is contact information and a link to the report itself. And I think at this point, I will turn it back over to the audience and Kate to field questions.
Hello, everyone. If now is the time, if you'd like to submit any questions, you can use the question panel. Okay, I see a few. Let me scroll down to them. What is the base and highest neighborhood satisfaction level for this research? Do you need more detail on that question, presenters, or?
Jiayang, is this something that the data that you had shown earlier articulates?
Jiayang, are you on mute?
I was talking on mute. Sorry. So we used Likert scale, which is very unsatisfied to very satisfied. So that is the score to 1 to 4, and some no answers become 0 for this one. So I don't know, that explains the question well.
Well, the same person submitted a follow-up question, which was, how is neighborhood satisfaction measured in terms of a qualitative nature?
Yeah, like I just said, it's Likert scale. I just asked. From very unsatisfied, some are unsatisfied, some are satisfied, and very satisfied. Those, yeah. So
yeah, and from the qualitative perspective, we asked semi-structured interview questions to talk about people's neighborhoods and environments, to talk about barriers that were associated with mobility and aging in place, and so individuals had an opportunity to basically talk about what worked and what didn't work in their homes and neighborhoods in particular.
Great. Another question is, will you be looking at other areas outside of Salt Lake City and Portland, or is this kind of a one-off?
Ivis, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, now like this research, we're like transitioning into actually like getting publications. So we have not thought about expanding the work. However, I did wanted to mention that a lot of our work is also driven by the organizations that we work with, Assets and Unlimited Choices. So I mean, we hope that this is useful to them. So an idea would be to expand it to where they have other clients, and part of it is like to also show that what they're doing in the home modifications are a good way of spending funds. I think that the way that we envision this is like, at least with Assist, CDBG funds were like being threatened. So the idea of like showing more evidence was like in the back of our heads. So I think that because this is community engaged research, it will be, we are interested in continuing relationships with those organizations, and perhaps we can again expand it to their service areas, or think of expanding it with other researchers in other areas as well. But for now, we are concentrating on like getting publications out of this research.
Great.
I would like to highlight as well, sorry, Kate, is that the idea of kind of pulling together these validated instruments and semi-structured interviews was to try and create a kind of research model and protocol that could be used in other places, which is why the final report has all of those in there. And they're the validated instruments we would probably recommend continuing to use as they were intended, since they are validated. But the semi-structured interviews could be tailored in some ways if need be. If you were working with a population, older adults and people with disabilities, but weren't really looking at the home modifications in particular, you might be able to modify some of those questions to kind of really tailor other life space mobility and aging and kind of questions into direct research that way. But really, one of the things that we tried to do with this research was to create a new research model that could be used, expanded, and kind of tweaked in the future.
Wonderful. Another question, just to keep jumping around. Another person had asked, what N size were you originally looking for in your research? And I'm not sure at which slide specifically that was referencing, but
interestingly enough, I think that we had targeted around 100 people total. It may have been, I'm not sure if the original proposal used 50 as well, but we actually struggled a little bit with kind of finding respondents, because we had to go down a list that was created by the partner agencies, and there were folks who had moved, who had died, because this was a kind of exploratory project in many ways of finding a method that worked. We weren't shooting for an N that was higher. And one of the biggest challenges, I'll be honest with everyone listening, was the time it took to conduct these interviews. So we were in people's homes from around 2 hours, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little bit more. So there was a daunting aspect of getting an older person or a person with a disability to sit down and talk for 2 hours over a range of questions. So just keep that in mind if replicating and or tweaking this type of work in the future.
great, that's great insight. I have another question for you. Do you have any transit training programs in place for older adults who are interested in taking transit for the first time? Or if you know of any, I know, Alan, that you work closely with the city. Maybe you can comment on that city level, or?
In fact, it's Ride Connection, which is a nonprofit transit provider, including paratransit services, that does a travel training program. I forget the name of it. It's not the Ride Ambassador program, but I think it is called the Travel Training Program. And they work with older adults and people with disabilities to get them comfortable using fixed route transit on their own.
Do you have any examples in Utah, Ivis and Jayon?
No, not that I know of, no.
Yeah, I think when people in senior center or community center requested Utah Transit Authority, they might can provide them, but many older adults I met in the interview, they have no idea about this kinds of program and they never experienced. So yeah, this is good idea for them to use more public transit, I think.
Absolutely, especially as public transit continues to change and we shift to electronic fares and whatnot. One of the attendees pitched in and said that Ride Connections travel training program specifically is called RideWise. Thank you, Russ.
Oh, I just wanted to add that a lot of people actually talked about their family members, especially like kids, like, like grandchildren that actually rode the bus or took the train, and they will like teach them how to use it. So I think that that was very interesting, how they learned it from someone that also was transit dependent with children and youth.
Another question, do you think individuals can age in place within the current landscape of urban sprawl? How? What would the ideal type of urban landscape look like?
That is a very large question. I would start by saying that the retrofitting of suburbs is something that's already underway, but it needs to be thought about and planned in conjunction with things like autonomous vehicles, changing patterns of transit modes. I don't think inherently it's impossible to change the landscape of suburban communities for aging in place, but that density is needed in order to have transit options that would be in place. I think that there's the deconstruction in some ways of what would be auto-centric kind of areas that are harmful in some ways to older adults, and the need for looking at communities in places that are either underserved or where infrastructure has not caught up. So for instance, in Portland, if you live in the Southwest Hills or you live in outer East Portland, you're much more likely to live in a place without a sidewalk or curb cuts or with streets that are very difficult to cross, which would inhibit an individual's ability to find that life space mobility outside of the home. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done with suburban communities, but that the lower density opportunities, the redevelopment opportunities for strip malls and parking lots is ripe for opportunity in the future. So I don't think it's impossible, but I think it will take coordinated strategic planning and capital projects in cities to really change the way that's aging in place in suburbia is going to work.
And I just wanted to add to that, that even like people who like live in places that were very accessible, more like in the central city where you have like supermarkets and transit is there. One issue is affordability. So that's something that we were not really looking in our research. But when we were looking at mobile parks, for instance, that might be very accessible, even people were homeowners, they still had to pay a lot for renting a lot. And the same thing with like older adults, as like Alan was mentioning, having these pressures of displacement and gentrification. And I think in particular in our research, since we were talking with like low income individuals, this became particularly important. But it's just like, yes, retrofitting suburban spaces so they are more accessible is important, but also maintaining affordability is very important in places that already have that accessibility.
Wonderful. We are approaching the end of our webinar, and I just wanted to wrap up with a couple more comments from folks. I had someone who asked if you could conduct the research in their country. I had someone who asked if you will be presenting any of this research at TRB or any city councils, etc. I don't know if you guys submitted a paper to TRB, if you'll be there this year.
We did not submit to TRB, although we do have some upcoming presentations at the, it's at APA and then the Gerontological Society of America as well. So kind of presenting to folks on the planning and gerontology sides. And as Ivis said, we are working on 2 publications as well that would kind of reach the gerontology community and the planning and architecture community as well.
Wonderful. And we'll also, Ivis will be moderating a panel at the previously mentioned Transportation and Community Summit here in Portland. It's at PSU, and it's a supporting active mobility for all kind of session that will talk about research from 4 different researchers, including Jennifer Dill and a couple others. So that if that's of interest to you to join us this September, you can hear from Ivis then. And one thing also I wanted to add was we did NITSE. This is a focus and an important topic for us. Just a few weeks ago, we granted a new project is funded with a different set of researchers. But they will be developing, it's on developing strategies to enhance mobility and accessibility for community dwelling older adults. The focus is on providing policymakers specific strategies for improving mobility. So I feel like it's a really complementary project to the work that Ivis and Jayang and Alan have already done. So you can look forward to that coming out in maybe a year or so. So it's just funded, but we will be continuing this thread of, enhancing mobility for all and the different age regions. So that concludes our webinar. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for bearing with my technical difficulties at the beginning. I didn't see everyone piping in saying, hey, I can hear you, so thank you for letting me know and bearing with me. And thank you to Ivis, Alan, and Jayang for sharing their work. You can see our other professional development offerings on our website. And I hope you will join us for another webinar and enjoy the rest of your day. And for those of you who asked, yes, you will have the slides and you will also have a recording of today's webinar accessible. So you'll be able to share them with your colleagues. All right, thank you everyone.